Hello and welcome back to another Horus Heresy painting tutorial. In this video I'll be showing you how you can paint the word bearers in their pre-Heresy Legion colours, and I'll be using the Citadel range of paints to do so. So here we have the Space Marine, and as you can see here I've kept the arm and the bolter separate so that I can actually get to the chest area a lot more easily. Now I've primed the miniature with Chaos Black, and the reason for that is because it's quite a dark colour in which to work on, and we get some really nice shading in the recesses. Now the first colour we're actually going to be painting onto the armour is Mephiston Red. Now the reason why I'm going for Mephiston Red is because it's a base colour, which means it will cover really nicely. It's also a nice deep red in which we can highlight upwards from. So I want to paint the red onto the entirety of the armour, and I've added a slight amount of water into this mix, and this will allow me to get nice coverage on the armour. You can see there I'm painting the legs. Now what you're best doing is looking into the actual box art to see exactly which areas need to be painted red and which areas need to be painted black. Now most of the armour is going to be red, of course, however the shoulder pads are going to be kept black. So here you can see that all of the power armour has been primed with Mephiston Red. Now I wouldn't worry too much at this stage if you overspill onto other areas, as you can paint over these later on, that's not a problem. And I would recommend doing a couple of thin layers to get this nice even coverage that I've got here, as opposed to doing one thick layer. Now the next step is to apply some shading, and for this I'll be using Nuln Oil. However, I don't want this going on as it is, so I'll be mixing this with some Lamium Medium, and this will thin it out and it won't go on quite as dark. So I'm just going to be using a medium brush to paint this onto the actual miniature. There we go. You can see just the slightly thinner Nuln Oil is going into the recesses still, but it's not quite darkening the armour the same as it would do by applying it straight out of the pot. So I'm just going to apply this using this medium brush across all of the areas of the miniature where we can see the power armour, and this will apply some nice shading to the recesses. So once the wash of Nuln Oil is dry, we can now start work on some of the highlights, and for this we'll be using Evil Sunz Scarlet, and we'll be running this over all of the edges of the red armour. Now to assist in this, we'll be mixing it with a small amount of Lamium Medium, as this will thin it down nicely and provide a much more even flow. So using a smaller detail brush, I'll be painting this along the edges, and I'll be just painting a very thin line. We don't want to obscure the detail, the shading in the recesses, so we'll just be running this along the edges. Quite a thin line along like so. Now mixing it with the Lamium Medium really makes this a lot easier, because if we make it too runny then it will act more like a wash and we won't actually get this nice stark line running along the edge, and if we don't actually put enough in we'll actually get a very blobby line and it won't quite flow as well, it won't be quite as easy to paint the lines on with. So now that we've completed the first stage of highlights, we can start moving on to the second stage, and for this we'll be using Fire Dragon Bright. Now we'll be applying this paint onto the very corners of the armour, as opposed to just doing on every single edge. We'll be applying it mainly on the upper edges to simulate where the light is hitting. So just like before, I'm using the thin brush, and I've applied a small amount of Lamium Medium onto my paint, and this will allow it to flow a lot better onto the edges. So as you can see here, I'm just going to be painting a small section just onto the upper corners there. We don't want to paint too much, we don't want to overpower it, and we want to keep the original red highlight that we used before still visible. So if we just apply it to the top corners, such as these on the helmet, and we're just slightly dragging the brush across the edges like so. Now we're going to do this for all of the sections on the upper head, so for example the helmet here, and also on the top of the backpack, and also on the arms as well. So the final step for painting the power armour is to apply some weathering, and for this we'll be using the edge paint Lugganoth Orange. Now when we're painting the weathering, we'll be doing this perpendicular to the edges of the power armour, and we'll be doing this on areas where we would imagine that there will be most weathering, such as the feet, around the legs, also the helmet for example, just anywhere where you would expect wear and tear to take place. So as the edge paints are actually quite thinned down already, we don't actually need to apply any Lamium Medium for these. I'm using a thin brush once again, and I'm going to be applying some weathering to this right arm and knee plate there. So what we're going to do is running the brush perpendicular to the edge, so I'll be going vertically for this moment. I'm just running this up and down in short, almost scratches, as if the knee pad has been scratched. I'm going to just evening that out across there. We're placing this across the body in different areas, so for example we're going to paint a little bit more onto the top of the power armour like so. As you can imagine, the Space Marines crawled through a low door for example, So there we go, just a few small scratches. And you can apply some generic scratches across the armour as well. So if I just bring you around to one of the leg plates here, I'm just going to get a little bit more Kindle Flame onto my brush and just paint a very light line. Now I don't want to be pressing on too hard, I almost want to just let the brushes get placed across the armour. You can just see there we get a couple of scratches. I'm going to apply another one in a slightly different direction, like so. So we've got a slight scratch in the armour there. I'm going to apply this across the rest of the miniature. So now that the armour is complete, we can now start moving on to some of the other areas. And first of all, we're going to be neatening up some of the areas such as the shoulder pads as well. And we're also going to be painting in some of the details in between the armours, as you can see there, just between the legs. And we're painting this with a Abaddon Black. So I'm painting the detailing in the grooves there. I'll be using a smaller detail brush for this, so I'll be just painting this inside there. Now I've mixed it with a small amount of millenium medium just so I can improve the flow slightly. And the Abaddon Black is also a base paint, which will mean it will cover the red areas nicely. So I'm just making sure not to spill over, as we don't want to paint the armour again. You can see that. So in addition to that, we'll also need to neaten up any areas that we might have overspilled in the past. So for example, I'll be using the bolter here. So if I just bring in a little bit more paint, so you can see how the paint is overspilled onto the stock there. I'll just be painting a small amount of black just to cover up any areas that we may have overspilt in earlier sections. So now that we've completed the cleanup with the Abaddon Black, we can now move on to highlighting the black areas. And for this we'll be using Dawnstone and painting this along the edges of anywhere that's black, so that'll be the shoulder pads and also any of the vents on the back, and also the weapon stock as well. So once again I'm using the detail brush to highlight the edges. I'm just going to highlight this edge around the vent on the power pack on the back. I'm just going to lightly drag the paintbrush along the edge there. I haven't got too much paint on this brush, just enough so that when I lightly drag it across, it creates this thin line as opposed to a large blob of paint. I guess I'm just going to do the same technique across the entirety of the black areas, and then we'll move on to the next step. So now that the first highlight is complete, we'll now be moving on to a second grey highlight. And for this we'll be using Administratum Grey, and we'll be focusing on more of the upper areas of the where we've already done highlights. So for example, on the shoulder pads here we'll just be doing the top sections. On the power pack it'll just be anything at the top, anywhere really where the light will actually be hitting the objects on the top. So I'm using a small detail brush again, and I'll just be running this along the edge that we've already painted, but using the upper edge as opposed to all of the edges. So for example here, using the same technique as before, just dragging it lightly across the end there. Now I've watered this down slightly with millenium medium, which will improve the flow and make this a lot easier. So I've done that top edge there, so I'll do the same on the other side, like so. And I'll be continuing this technique across the miniature. The next areas that we'll be focusing on are any leather areas on the miniature. Now this can include holsters such as this here, also ammo pouches, and also the sheath for the sword as well. And I'll be base coating these with Steel Legion Drab. So once again I'm using my medium detail brush. Now the reason why I've gone for Steel Legion Drab is because it's a nice kind of tanned leather colour. It's also a base colour as well, which means it will cover quite nicely over the black areas as well. So I'm just using this, making sure that I've not to overlap onto any of the areas which I've already painted. It doesn't matter too much about the handles at this point, as we'll be painting these over later on. So once the base coat is dry on the leather areas, we'll now be performing a wash. And for this we'll be using Agrax Earthshade, and we're washing this over the entirety of the leather. So I'm using the medium detail brush again to perform this wash. I'm just washing the Agrax Earthshade across the entirety of the leather, making sure that I get into all of the recesses like this, as you can see there. And one thing you want to make sure you do is don't overspill onto the other areas that you've painted. With it being a wash, you can actually quite easily wipe it off afterwards, but it's easier if you just stay away from those areas to begin with. So once the Agrax Earthshade wash is complete, we can now start on some more highlights. And for this we'll be using Wreckar Flesh, and we'll be highlighting the edges of the leather areas with this. So we will be highlighting the leather areas in much the same way as we did the first layer of the armour. And I've got my small detail brush here with a small amount of Wreckar Flesh, and I've watered it down slightly as well. I'm just going to be dragging it lightly across the edges in the same way as we have done previously, which creates a nice edge highlight like so. So I'm just going to complete this on the rest of the miniature, and then we can move on to the next step. The final non-metallic step for painting this miniature is to paint the eye lenses, and we'll be starting off with a base coat of Warpstone Glow. So as the eye lenses are quite small, I'll be using the small detail brush again. And I've only got a small amount of paint on the very tip of this, as I don't want to overspill onto the armour. I'm just going to be gently painting to the eye lenses there, and I've only added a slight amount of water here. I don't want it to be overspilling too far. Just a couple of horizontal strokes should fill in the most of the eye. So that's one lens, and we'll just flip this over, and we'll do the same to the second lens. So now that the Warpstone Glow is now in the eyes, we can now wash over this with Bealtan Green, and this will create some nice shading. So as I did when I applied the base layer, I'm going to be using my small detail brush again. Now when you're actually washing the eyes, you only need to apply a small amount of wash in there. You don't want to overfill the area. So you can see here, I'm just doing a small amount, and it's just spilling into the recesses there. Try not to get it onto the rest of the miniature, as we don't want to obscure the detail too much. So once the wash is dry, we can now continue with the lenses. Now I'll be doing a small line of moot green at the bottom of the lenses, which will kind of create a nice glass effect. So I'm painting the highlight onto the lenses. You want to make sure that the brush you use is the smallest one you have access to. I'm just using a small detail brush here, and I've watered it down ever so slightly. I just want to apply a slight line onto the bottom of the lens there, and this will create a nice glass effect. Just lightly applying it there. I don't want to overspill onto the red areas if possible. Just put a little bit more paint on there. As I mentioned before, it's very important to avoid overspilling onto the areas that you've already painted. And you can see there, I just applied a very small line onto the bottom, and I'll do the same for this lens as well. The final step for painting the lenses and achieving that glass effect is to apply a small dot of ceramite white onto the outer corners of the lenses, such as here and also on this side over here. So as before, we want to make sure that the brush we're using is the smallest we have access to, and I've got a small amount of ceramite white onto the end here. Now all you want to do is to place a small dot into this top right corner here, and this will create a kind of reflection effect and make the lens look like they're actually glass, and you can see that's just one there. A small dot is all you need, and just on the other side, very lightly just press onto the same area. Like so. So now that all of the areas have been painted, we can now move on to the metallic paints. Now the reason why we leave it to this stage is because we want to avoid any cross-contamination of the metal flakes into the non-metallic paints, such as the armour and everywhere else that we've painted so far. Now the first paint we'll be using to paint the metal areas is Ironbreaker. Now as opposed to using Lead Belcher, which is a slightly darker version, the reason why I'm using this is because the word bearers have quite a bright silver on their armour. Now I'll be using this on the trim on the shoulder pads, the harness on the chest pad, a few of the details on the helmet such as these pipes here, and also on the rest of the areas on the weapon. So for painting the metal areas, we can get away with using a slightly larger brush than we have been doing in the last steps. So I'll be using a medium detail brush, and I'll just be painting all of the silver areas, just completely covering over the areas. Now we want to make sure that you're very careful as to avoid painting onto the areas you've already painted, because it is quite difficult to remove the silver flakes once they actually get embedded onto the miniature. So be very careful at this stage and try to avoid overspilling onto any other areas. So following completion of the metallic base layer, we're now going to be washing over all the metal areas with Nuln Oil. Now, as with the wash that we made on the leather areas, we can actually be quite liberal at this stage. It doesn't matter too much if we apply too much, as it will only slightly darken the metallic areas. So I'm just using a medium detail brush, and I'm just avoiding over spilling into the red areas, but if you do a slight amount, it's not too bad. You can just wipe it off, and it'll just act as additional shading. So I'm just going to apply this across the rest of the miniature. So with the wash now dry, the final step is to highlight along the edges of the metal areas with Runefang Steel. So as I've done with the previous highlights in this tutorial, I've got a small amount of Runefang Steel on the tip of my small detail brush here. I'm just going to drag it along some of the metal edges. So if I just spin this around here so we can see the back power pack there, and I'm just going to run the Runefang Steel across the edges there, just highlighting any area that's raised. If I do the same thing for the bolt pistol here in the holster, you can see the edge there, So going to apply this small amount of Runefang steel. It'll give this effect of metal that's tarnished but has also been worn down as well, with some scratches and such along the edges. So I'm going to continue this technique across all of the metal areas onto the miniature, including the bolter. So now that all of the metal areas are complete, we have one more thing to do. Now this step is optional, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be painting on all of the scripture that's dotted about the armour, and for this we'll be using ceramite white. So for painting on the text, you want to use the smallest brush you have, and I've got my small detail brush here, and I'm using some ceramite white, and I've mixed it with a little bit of millenium medium, and this will give it a much better flow. So I'm going to get a small amount of paint onto my brush. I'm going to drag this horizontally, going along the actual surface of the armour, and make slight little squiggles and slight gaps in between. So as you can see here, I'm just going to do a small, very gentle line across the armour, like so, with small line breaks and variations in height, and this will create a nice text effect onto the armour. And if I can just continue with a couple more lines. So I'm going to apply this to a few more areas of the armour, and then we can get an overall summary for this tutorial. And here we have the completed word bearer. As you can see, I've attached it to a base, and the only thing that's left to do now is to apply some transfers to the shoulder pads. If you enjoyed this tutorial and would like to see me paint more, then let me know in the comments below which legions you would like me to see and make a tutorial for next. Also, if you would like to support me in making my tutorials, you can find a link to my Patreon account in the description below as well. So until next time, thanks for watching and goodbye.